Well, more bipartisan meetings are now in the works as the White House tries to sell a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. But skepticism of a deal is growing on both sides of the aisle. Lawmakers drawing a clear line in the sand during President Biden's first bipartisan get-together. My next guest was in yesterday's meeting at the White House. He is Republican Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi. He is the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Key in these negotiations. Senator, thanks so much for taking the time this morning.
Thank you, Jim. Glad to be with you.
So to your credit, you were in that meeting there, attempting a bipartisan approach to this. Before you went in, you said you were willing to negotiate, but you since said that any increase in taxes, corporate taxes, to pay for the plan is really a non-starter for Republicans. And I wonder, are you willing to negotiate on the issue of taxes?
Well, let me say this. I don't think there were that many lines drawn in the sand yesterday. I do think that the president wants this plan to not only build infrastructure, but really to give our economy a big boost. And the point I'm making to the president is to raise corporate taxes on small business job creators actually is a job killer, and I don't think he wants to do that. But let me say this, Jim. Those of us in Washington, D.C. need to get this done so we can show the country that we can do big things in a bipartisan way. And after the meeting yesterday, I have every hope and belief that both sides really are negotiating in good faith.
That's good to hear. And I think, listen, the American people, our viewers, happy to hear that. I just wonder then what the middle ground is here, right? Because as you know, Republicans and Democrats have been talking for years about infrastructure as a bipartisan area of agreement. Do you see perhaps a middle ground where President Biden brings down his target of $2 trillion, maybe $2 trillion, and Republicans agree to a small tax increase?
I think we're definitely going to have to pay for this infrastructure bill. I mean, we've during the pandemic we did a lot of things and added it to the national debt because it was a recession, if not a depression, and we had to act quickly. But I think both sides, the president and Republicans, acknowledge that this has to be paid for. He was clear yesterday. He's not into deficit financing for this. But there's another thing. We've been passing infrastructure bills every year or so for quite some time now. The idea now is to make those infrastructure programs much bigger. But there was a lot of talk yesterday from Republicans and Democrats about taking the programs we have now and simply adding to them. We know what works. Congressman Price from North Carolina was talking about doing a portion of the housing through the THUD appropriation bill, something he's very familiar with and something that has worked. Our friends in the Transportation Department know about the BUILD grant and the infra grant and the Chrissy grant. So we simply can plus those up, not reinvent the wheel, and do a lot more building for America.
You say it has to be paid for. I wonder, are you therefore not ruling out some kind of tax increase to pay for it, perhaps even a gasoline tax?
I'm not ruling out some kind of pay for, absolutely. If you're going to spend, say, $600 billion over several years on an infrastructure program that's much bigger than we've had before, absolutely. We have to be grown-ups and say it has to be paid for. So we're not going to be able to come up with that money out of thin air. And yes, normally when we talk about infrastructure financing, we're talking about some sort of user pays system so that the businesses and the individuals that actually use the roads more pay their fair share. And if it's a fair share, I think the American people will understand that. It's clearly not something we've worked out yet. But I'll tell you, I am really optimistic that we could take existing programs, ones that we're familiar with, ones that the bureaucracy have already been involved in, and come up with a program that will make Republicans and Democrats proud.
Well, optimism, not something folks hear often, so I'm sure a lot of folks listening right now welcome that. I do want to ask about the future of your party, because as you know, there's quite a public disagreement about the direction of the party going forward. The former President Trump, who you've been a supporter of, over the weekend said that the leader of your party in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, is a stone-cold loser, a dumb SOB. I won't repeat his language there. I just wonder what your reaction is to that.
Well, former President Trump has a large following out there among members of our party, and I think we all acknowledge that. I don't think comments like that are helpful, and I think as this year 2021 moves along, and then we move into 2022, the actual election year, I think we'll be more focused and should be more focused on the different approaches of the two parties. And I think in an off-year election, the first even-numbered election after a presidential race, the party that is not in power often gains seats, and I think there'll be every reason for the American people to vote for some sort of balance.
Well, Senator Roger Wicker, we enjoyed having you on the program. You're welcome back anytime. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim.
A very good Tuesday morning to you. I'm Jim Sciutto, and we begin this morning with major breaking news. The CDC and FDA are recommending that all use of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine be temporarily paused. Why? 6 reported cases here in the U.S. of a rare and severe type of blood clot. We should note that is 6 cases of 6.8 million doses of the vaccine that have now been administered so far in the U.S. A CDC advisory board will meet tomorrow. The FDA is investigating as well, and they will answer questions about this decision live in the next hour. We're going to be following that and bring you all the information they bring us. Joining me now is CNN senior medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen. This is a significant announcement. How impactful?
You know, as far as the supply goes, Jim, my sources are telling me, and the government's already said, they don't think it will really be an impact. We have enough, at least, for quite some time with Moderna and Pfizer. But of course, it might be very shocking to wake up this morning and think, wow, I took the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I'm one of those millions of people. Does this mean I'm going to get a blood clot? You just went through the numbers, and I want to go through them again, Jim, to talk about how extremely rare these blood clots are. Let's go over those numbers. Nearly 7 million people in the United States have received Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, and there have been 6 cases reported of this rare but very serious brain blood clot. They've all been in women ages 18 to 48, and the symptoms tend to appear 6 to 8 days after vaccination. So if you got the J&J vaccine, in early March, this is not something that you need to worry about, for example. Now let's talk about under what condition you would want to contact your healthcare provider. If you develop these symptoms within 3 weeks of receiving the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, call your healthcare provider. Severe headache, abdominal pain, leg pain, and shortness of breath. The reason for some of these is not because of a potential brain clot, but you could also it is possible that this vaccine could be associated with other kinds of clots too, such as clots in the abdomen. Now, this is an example of the system really working the way that it should. They were vigilant about looking for these things. They found them. They paused it. There's going to be an emergency meeting tomorrow of an advisory committee to the CDC to see what the next steps might be. But yes, it's certainly, this is not great news. This is a vaccine that a lot of people liked because it was only one shot. A lot of vaccine hesitant people liked it because it was only one shot. It didn't need to be kept at these super cold temperatures like Moderna and Pfizer need to be kept at. And so this is definitely this is not a great thing that happened, but certainly there is still enough vaccine, and this is not a concern with either the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine. Jim?
It's a very important point there. Elizabeth Cohen, thanks very much. Let's bring in now CNN Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta, as well as Dr. Carlos Del Rio. He's the Executive Associate Dean at Emory University School of Medicine. Thanks to both of you. Sanjay, if I could begin with you, just looking at the data here, 6 cases out of 6.8 million Johnson & Johnson doses. That is extremely rare, literally 1 in a million. And I wonder, is that data that typically would lead to a pause like this?
Well, we're dealing with, everything here is sort of unprecedented in terms of looking at this information real time, making these sorts of decisions. I mean, I don't know, if there's an absolute threshold here, but I will say, Jim, this is rare, but there is a signal here that we're seeing, and that warrants an investigation. I mean, as Elizabeth was just talking about, it's primarily women between the ages of 18 and 48. Why women of that age? We saw a similar sort of thing with the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe, you remember, and that's also a similar type of vaccine, this adenovirus vaccine. It's different than the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. So this is why you pause it, to basically investigate what's going on here. You remember quickly, Jim, in Europe, they basically came to the conclusion, look, there were clots that seemed to be associated, but the benefits of the vaccine still outweigh the risks. That's what the European Medicine Association said. The UK regulator said sort of the same thing, except let's not use AstraZeneca vaccine over there for people under the age of 30, for example. So we'll see how we sort of come down on this. But given that we have so much of the other Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, we'll see how the regulators sort of proceed forward. But the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, obviously, this concern is going to fuel vaccine hesitancy towards this particular vaccine.
Sanjay, to that point, though, you make a very important point that the essential science of the J&J vaccine, as opposed to the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine, is different. They're different, fundamentally different. To folks at home who are listening right now, might already have an appointment, they're prepared to sign up for an appointment for any of these vaccines, explain to them that difference and why they should not associate this problem with J&J with Pfizer and Moderna.
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking that. I think there's two important points here. One is that they are different vaccines, even though these vaccines ultimately are all sort of trying to do the same thing, which is stimulate the body to have these antibodies. They can do it in very different ways. So the mRNA vaccines, which are Pfizer, Moderna, are different than the adenovirus vaccines, which are AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. But I think more to the point, you look at the number on the screen, 189 million doses have been administered. The vast majority of those have been these mRNA vaccines, and we haven't seen the safety signals. I mean, it's good in one way. You pick up a 1 in a million thing. It kind of shows you that the safety signal sort of evaluation is working. They're finding these 1 in a million sort of occurrences. They don't see those with the mRNA vaccines. I really hope that people continue to get vaccinated.
No question. And you make a point, given that figure there, close to 200 million doses administered. At 6 million, that's about 3%, just over 3% of the total number of doses, so a small minority. Dr. Del Rio, let's speak, though, if we can, to those 6 million people right now. If you have received this, I mean, what's key about these symptoms is that the data shows they appear within 6 to 8 days. And I want to put up on the screen again the symptoms that doctors are saying you should look for, just so folks can kind of process it as you speak. Severe headache, abdominal pain, leg pain, shortness of breath. Speak to folks right now who may have had J&J. What should they do now?
I mean, I think the great majority of people need not to worry, because this is a very rare side effect. But if I was a young person, and particularly if I was a young woman under the age of 50 and I got the J&J vaccine in the last 2 weeks, I'd probably be paying attention to those kinds of symptoms, headache, abdominal pain, leg pain. And if I were to get those symptoms, I would rapidly contact my doctor, my healthcare provider, and be seen right away.
Mm-hmm. Now, when I look at those symptoms, and I imagine some folks at home might think the same thing, headaches are pretty common, right? Leg pain can be common and can be caused by a lot of things. I mean, I suppose your advice there, Dr. Del Rio, is okay. To be cautious. If you have those, go to your doctor and let your doctor make the judgment in effect.
And that is correct. I mean, I think if you have a headache, don't worry initially, but if that headache persists, if that headache continues, if it's an unusual headache, the headache you would see here is not the headache you get from, maybe, being tired or something like that. It's a more intense type of headache. Abdominal pain. I mean, I would think that you need to pay attention to your body. And if you see something that just doesn't seem right, don't ignore it. Just go be evaluated.
Abundance of caution. Sanjay, you heard Elizabeth Cohen make the point that given the far greater percentage of vaccine doses that are coming from Pfizer and Moderna, and given their supplies and ramping up production, that it is not expected that this J&J pause slows down the overall vaccination rate in this country. And J&J, by the way, as we've reported, had another issue with production a couple of weeks ago. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you agree that this won't slow things down?
Yeah, I think it won't prevent us from getting to this ultimate goal. There's plenty of Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. We have enough to vaccinate 300 million people with those vaccines alone. So that's pretty significant. Also, as you point out, because of the manufacturing concerns, completely unrelated to the conversation about clotting, they were going to decrease allocation by 84% this week. Johnson & Johnson was already, as they address these manufacturing concerns. So I don't want to minimize this problem, and this needs to be investigated. The United States was not as dependent on Johnson & Johnson vaccine as other countries around the world are dependent on J&J and AstraZeneca. So it's probably going to be a bigger problem globally than here in this country. But, we got to pay attention globally as well.
Yeah, and it speaks to the wisdom that we have more than one option in this country. Dr. Del Rio, I don't want to prejudge any final conclusions here. This is a pause. FDA is going to investigate. CDC is going to look at the data. But given what we saw with AstraZeneca, where they had a blood clot issue, they looked at it, and as Sanjay said, they said, well, actually, health benefits far outweigh the very rare instances of problems here. Is that an outcome that is possible with J&J here as well? Possible. We don't know, but is it possible?
I think it's going to be possible. I think it could be very likely that the FDA and the CDC advisory committee say, don't use this vaccine, but in young people, use it in people over the age of 50 or the age of 40. I mean, they'll come up with an age saying below this age you shouldn't use it. But, the ironic thing is that a lot of young people wanted to use this vaccine because it's a one-shot vaccine. Yeah. So in a way, it just changes dramatically how we have to think about this. But again, often problems disrupt plans. And I think what you need to do is pivot rapidly and adjust. And again, I want to emphasize the benefit of vaccination far outweighed right now, the risk of dying of COVID. If you're 15 years old, or if you're 18 or 20 years old, your chance of having this side effect with the J&J vaccine is 1 in a million. If you were to get COVID, the possibility of you dying from COVID at that age is about 55 in a million.
Yeah, that's a big difference. 55 times, right? The danger. Dr. Del Rio, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, thanks so much to both of you for helping steer through the fog on this.
You got it. Thank you.
Hundreds of big American businesses, including some of the biggest, Apple, Coca-Cola, Walmart, are calling on President Biden to set new, even more aggressive goals for cutting carbon emissions. In a letter released ahead of next week's White House Climate Change Summit, corporate leaders say the U.S. needs to slash CO2 emissions by at least 50% by just 2030, almost doubling the targets set in the Paris Climate Agreement. For more on the Biden administration's commitment to climate change, joining me now is Presidential Envoy on Climate, former Secretary of State, of course, John Kerry. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for taking the time this morning.
Happy to be with you. Thank you, Jim.
I want to get to those corporate commitments because they are important, but you just returned from an overseas trip, in effect building support for Biden's approach. And I want to begin with India because there's, of course, a lot of talk of China, but India, it'll soon compete with the U.S. And China on global emissions. In your meetings there, did India make any hard commitments on carbon emissions cuts?
Yes, they did. They made a commitment to achieve a new implementation of about 450 gigawatts of renewable power, most of it coming from solar, but some of it from wind. And we actually entered into a partnership there where we will assist, along with other nations, to help bring finance. And when I say finance, I'm not talking about taxpayer dollar. I'm talking about the private sector investing in this deployment, which will require some changes by India in certain parts of what it does. But that's a huge amount. That amount would allow India to keep track with 1.5 degrees centigrade limitation on the increase of the Earth's temperature. That's what the scientists tell us we must achieve. So India would, in fact, be one of the leaders if that implementation takes place, despite the fact they have some coal.
You also met with oil producers in the UAE. Of course, you need oil-producing nations on board here. I just wonder, did you leave there convinced that they are willing to make hard commitments here, or do you worry? Does part of you worry they're trying to make nice with the new U.S. administration, might hope to wait you out?
Well, Jim, obviously, all commitments have to be authenticated, they have to be transparent, they have to be accountable. And that is part of a process that is being set up by this international meeting, which will convene in Glasgow in November 1st. But the answer is yes, they are doing a lot of this. I mean, you take the UAE, I flew over and looked at the largest solar plant in that region, some 3.5 million panels that are out there producing, more than 1,000 megawatts of power. They're going to be deploying more. They're doing research on hydrogen. They're trying to push hydrogen as an alternative fuel. They understand that even if you're an oil-producing nation today, you have to diversify. And what you see is many, not all, but many major oil and gas corporations are now transitioning into being energy companies. And they're also investing in alternatives and renewables. So this is a new age. This is a new moment. And I think there's going to be an entirely new marketplace opening up. It'll be the world's largest marketplace because it's energy. 4.5, 5 billion users today, going up to 9 billion in the next 30 years. That's a big market. And so there's a rush by a lot of folks to help produce the technologies and the processes that will get us where we need to go.
Understood. It's CNN's reporting that your next stop is China. We know, everyone knows, you can't do climate emissions controls without getting China on board. But I wonder, looking at that meeting, the first meeting, high level, between the Biden administration and Chinese officials in Alaska a couple of weeks ago, and just how openly difficult it was, do you foresee being able to cooperate with China on the issue of climate change when you have such open, even hostile disagreements on issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang?
Well, first of all, Jim, I can't confirm any travel at this point in time, but I can tell you that we cannot resolve the climate crisis without China being at the table and without China's cooperation. So it is absolutely critical. China is the largest emitter at about 28 to 30%. We're the second largest at about 15%. So just between the two of us, we got 45% of the world's emissions. President Biden is hosting a summit next week with world leaders. And more than 40 heads of state will be taking part in that virtual summit. And the president is asking every country to raise their ambition so that we can meet the targets of Paris and, in fact, exceed them and do what we need to do for the next 10 years. We hope China will join us.
Has Xi Jinping committed to taking part in Biden's summit next week?
No, he hasn't yet.
Okay. I want to ask you a big picture question here, because the U.S. has a problem to some degree with international agreements because they seem to be on the same partisan pendulum that domestic policy is, right? The Obama administration, you deeply involved, negotiated the Iran agreement. Trump pulls out, Biden administration trying to get back in. And I just wonder, as you're meeting with leaders, do they look at you at all or express skepticism and say, hey, we're happy to talk with you now, but heck, in 2024, we may have a whole new approach? And if so, what's your answer to that?
My answer is that what is happening now with respect to the climate crisis, Jim, is beyond any one politician anywhere. Mm-hmm. When you have major companies doing what they did yesterday, which is urging major cuts in emissions, and you have very large financial institutions that are laying out now the trillions of dollars they're going to invest over the course of the next 10 years, that's an economic movement that no one politician is going to be able to change. No single country could change that. The marketplace is transforming into a clean energy, new energy marketplace. And the opportunities for hydrogen fuel or battery storage or storage, period, or alternative means of capturing carbon and where and how you store it. This is just a gigantic marketplace. So I think we can hopefully come to agreement on these things. And with respect to China, yes, we have big disagreements with China on some key issues, absolutely. But climate has to stand alone. You know, you can't have those disagreements say, well, because of that, I'm not going to do anything about climate, because you're just killing yourself. Yeah. You're going to be hurting your own people. So hopefully everybody's going to come to the table and be reasonable. And you have to have a little bit of optimism in this business or you can't get up.
Yeah, you can't get up in the morning. I hear you on that. Secretary Kerry, we do wish you the best of luck and appreciate you joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll be right back. giving me that ceremony as well. We do begin, though, with the breaking news on Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. Joining me now, CNN senior medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen. Elizabeth, describe the data here that led to this decision.
Jim, this is really an example of the system working the way that it's supposed to. As you mentioned, millions of people have gotten this vaccine, and they monitored it to see if any odd things were happening, and they found, well, that something very odd and very serious and very rare was happening. So let's go over these numbers. So in the United States, nearly 7 million people have received the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and what's been documented is 6 cases of rare and serious brain blood clots, all in women ages 18 to 48, and the symptoms appear 6 to 13 days after vaccination. So I'm sure that people, especially young women who've been vaccinated with Johnson & Johnson recently, might be asking themselves, yikes, what should I look for? So again, I will say this is very rare, but there are certain symptoms that you should watch out for, and if you have them, you should call your healthcare provider. So this is right from the CDC. You should contact your healthcare provider if within 3 weeks of getting this vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you have a severe headache, abdominal pain, leg pain, or shortness of breath. Now, not all of those you would say, what does that have to do with a brain blood clot? Well, sometimes these blood clots theoretically could appear in other parts of your body as well. So, Jim, obviously this is not great news. No one wanted this to happen, but I want to temper this with one thing. We have been told by the federal government that achieving the vaccination goals is not dependent on J&J. It was only a very small percentage of all the vaccines that were being done. Moderna and Pfizer, those are being used in much higher numbers. Moderna and Pfizer do not have this blood clot concern. So the thinking is that we can reach the goals that we need to reach in the United States without using Johnson & Johnson. Jim?
That's right. J&J doses just about 3% of the total number of vaccines administered so far in this country. Elizabeth Cohen, thanks so much. Let's go to one of the sites, though, where Johnson & Johnson vaccines were expected to be administered. CNN's Bryn Gingras. She's at the Javits Center in New York, a major vaccination site. I got my own vaccination there. It was Pfizer, though. Bryn, what's the latest there? Is J&J a big part of New York's plan?
Yeah, well, if you remember, Jim, J&J helped actually make the Javits Center and other mass vaccination sites around the state into a 24/7 operation. So it wasn't, as Elizabeth said, a huge part of the distribution process, but it certainly added to it. And there were some disappointment from people we actually spoke to this morning who were arriving.
Bryn, hold that.